Okay, so what we're going to be doing in this video, now I've worked through a simple construction development, and then I've on top put a more simple or breakdown of the features and planes of the features. And that takes us to where we'd be ready to start adding some light and shadow. In nature, we don't really see line in this kind of aggressive or abrupt way. We see edges. So I try to make an assessment or a transition from my line or my linear drawings, my analytical studies, into value by thinking about every area of line as potentially being one of three types of forms, and then associating to those forms a few types of edges. So what I'll be thinking about to kind of make the bridge or bridge the linear into the tonal will be when I see the fall of light and shadow on a specific surface or part of the head, I'll ask myself, is that area more of a box, a cylinder, or a sphere? The reason is when I think about light hitting these specific forms, there's a really specific quality or look that I can always identify with the part of the head that's more sphere-like, or the part of the head that is more cylindrical, or the part of the head that might be more boxy and planar. And the way that I'm going to do that is by associating edge instead of, or in supplement to line. So the four edges that I'll be using as I start to work through this will be soft. So I think of a soft edge for spheres, a firm edge for cylinders, and a hard edge for boxes. So why? What's the reasoning for that? Well, when I think about lighting, and this is, we're not going to go through a whole kind of demonstration of light logic. The basic things that I'm going to think about here for lighting a sphere, or cylinder, or box would be that there's a form shadow. That would be the darkest part of the shadow that we currently see on the sphere. That's caused by light hitting the sphere from a specific angle. Right? And this kind of jumps to a certain point in an understanding or an assessment of light that we could backfill with some information in a longer discussion or lecture. For example, in terms of thinking about light, it's sometimes good to ask more questions like, one, what type of light? Is it sun? Is it candle? Is it, something totally different? And then what's the direction? Is it coming from the top, the bottom? But instead of just always thinking about, one type or style, this is a way you can maybe build on a bit more story. In some concept art or film, you can reduce that down to about 5 different value compositions. So if we start to associate light and its position with, one of 5 value compositions, whether it's high key, low key, high contrast, mid-range, in terms of your value scale and thinking of light and its placement, you can get a lot of gesture, a lot of storytelling from those simple steps. When I'm thinking more about the face, what I'm really looking for would be this area of the core shadow. So that core shadow would be something that I could also discuss in this as form, the form shadow. This would be the part of the shadow that's describing the form in its turn. And then I would look at that maybe in contrast to the areas that would be more cast shadows. So when I do longer discussions of light, I mostly describe the occurrence of light on the form based on 8 conditions: highlight, crest light, halftone, core shadow, shadow, reflected light, accent, cast. What I'm really looking for or focusing on for this video would be, where is the core shadow? And then what is the quality of halftone and edge that comes off of that? Right? So when I think of lighting, I don't think of trying to manufacture a copy of what's in front of me. I think about timing. So we're timing the viewer's eye as it tracks across the surface. So for me, this reads as a sphere or as a ball, because through the use of edge, I'm gradually taking your eye and pulling it across the surface of that form. So think here about the 8 conditions, right? The dark is the core shadow. This slightly lighter is the halftone. As we get up here, we're into the crest light, and then that highlight would be the brightest. So those are the existing conditions, and we could even chop them up. What I've done in my drawings is I try to make those plane changes really clear in an aggressive way so that I'm able to make sense of them and think them out and understand the form. When I get to this stage, I don't want that anymore, right? I'd like to be moving the eye across those in a way that's more consistent with the natural look. So the sphere, I always design with soft edges so that it moves the eye slowly across. The firm edges of the cylinder track the eye across a quicker volume, so that moves a little bit more fast or faster. The hard edges of the box, right, there's an exact, precise and fast or abrupt movement between those planes. So no edges. That's what I'm looking to do. So I understand the parts of the face now. A part's a ball. That's how we started the head. The nose is a box. The eye is a ball. I can set up all of my form and cast shadow to map based on those differences. What I can notice is maybe that the light is 3/4, slightly in front. And so the goal would be to just separate out to begin, where is the light-dark division? And so where is my most prominent change between these two values, a light side and a shadow side? And then if you can, the lighting condition gives you that read for that core shadow. You could just start to work there and move your way down. Let's leave the hair out for the moment and just take a look at this forehead. What plane or what kind of surface would your forehead be? Cylinder. You could really decide your own or kind of come up with your own. But my first line is going to be something that tries to, one, track where that difference is. So I'm thinking in this area, where is that light shadow difference for the forehead? Where does it turn? And then the other thing that I'm making sure to do is that all of my core shadows or the areas that are prominent separations of light from shadow, they're also still wrapping lines. They're lines that describe form. They won't be, in other words, sharp. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That could be a different style of lighting. This would be more chiaroscuro. This would be maybe more note tan, right? Thinking about that division of light and shadow more graphically. So one style isn't better than another. It's fun to learn both. So I'm going to do my core shadow here. Now it bumps out. And then I could see this starts to become more of a cylindrical form. So for the first line, that C curve that travels across the forehead, maybe I'll just soften this out. So now this would be edge. But that'd be that halftone soft edge that I want to read more consistently with the sphere. So you can see that I'm using the planes that are underneath to get an idea or an impression of that movement, but the edge eventually replaces the line. So no lines in nature, just edges. Now if I move down, so we start to look a little bit more at the cylinder, that's not nearly, right? So this wouldn't be as fast. So maybe I change the timing. The gradation here gives me more of that slow turn. So you could imagine that kind of moving away. This might be more abrupt. And now if I'm onto the socket, we know that the socket is a box. And there could be some complicating things here. Maybe there's muscle or skin around the socket that might soften it a bit. But I would say let's just keep this sharper for the moment just to get that sense of turn. So think about the surface again. What kind of surface have you made? That's consistent with that sharp break. This edge is a hard edge, looks different than the soft edge above. Maybe this plane change of the keystone is more of a cylindrical form. Right? It doesn't look like a sphere, it's not that smooth. It doesn't look totally like a box. It looks like it has kind of that gradual roll around it. So I'm always just mapping the shape. So what happens when this turns, now this blocks, and that creates a little cast shadow. So I can see that cast shadow has kind of a sharp knife point. It picks up and over that ligament or that structure of the eye, which is interesting. Now you can see how that might benefit you in terms of your understanding of the design of light and shadow, that all of these little forms that we spent time working up end up informing a shape design or a graphic design and implication for the figure. And then that comes, let's say, maybe up. Maybe it rolls up over that tarsus plate. And then I get a bit of a soft turn. So that'd be the cast shadow across. And then I get a form shadow for the lid. And so that form shadow is just the turn of the tarsus plate. Right, so I get the drop or the turn of that box there. It's always just sphere, cylinder, box. It's never, I'm lighting an eye. I think the moment we start thinking about lighting an eye, this is the moment we kind of lose the whole. It makes much more sense to light the bigger forms first. So what if we did the design of the whole of the eye as a form shadow, instead of trying to, what I think a lot of people might do, myself included, my less focused moments, try to render the pupil and iris and then somehow crowbar the lighting around it into those smaller areas. I think a good rule is try to always light the big ideas first, whether it's just the big graphic separation and edges or the forms themselves. So that would jump out. Maybe we're now onto the tarsus plate or the lower lid. Maybe that gives a little cast shadow over here onto some of that eye fat. And we get it looks like a little cast or something on the top of that cheek. So the design of this shape is informed by the structure underneath. And then now look at, if we think of this cheekbone as a cylinder, it could be a cylinder or a box. It's however you really want to interpret it. So maybe I just do the line, I separate light from shadow, and then I just give a bit of a gradation to that edge. This comes in, so this is the turn of that cheek, and then notice how this edge, I'm onto the malar fat pad, this is more gradual. I can see more of a gradation, in other words. So that's a slower timing, and I could explain that slower timing by saying that's a softer form. The surface topography is different. You could do the same thing for the nose, since we're kind of in that area. Maybe nose is like a cylinder there. So we'll try to get rid of that line and instead kind of soften out that edge. Let's move that down into the larger form of the nose here. And what I could start to see is maybe more of a ball. That's where if I really focus, I can see that coarse shadow, that dark separation of light and shadow. Here would be the plane change. Notice how that light breaks also very consistently with where we turned that box, that top to the bottom plane, and then up. So even those early rudimentary setup for the kind of the robotic head is still super informative to the decisions that I'm making now. But really, it's not even a bad idea just to sometimes spend time lighting those really simple preliminary studies instead of something with all the features built up. I feel like there might be a little cast shadow here. This would be a firm edge or a cylindrical edge on the turn of that. And the back gets a little softer. That bell or that fat pad for the back of the nose might be a little rounder. And then I start to track that into the bottom of the nose. And then I create, or I see that there's a cast shadow. So cast shadow is going to get that really abrupt, dark separation. So no edge, right? Some consistent with how I'd maybe use or draw a box. The fourth edge that I mentioned would be lost edges. So lost edges might be where light starts to weaken and there's just no clear distinction between the graphic separation of light and shadow. It's just atmospheric. Or they can exist as compositional edges, like you're playing with depth of field, things that are in focus and things that are out of focus to encourage a focal point. So here, I'm going to walk my cast shadow across and around these different surfaces. So it goes up, kind of jumps into that philtrum shape. And as long as I'm tracing or tracking form, it doesn't matter in this case that it would be a harder shape or edge. Maybe I see a little bit over here. So that's kind of up behind that nostril, kind of tracks some of that plane change in the malar fat. And so we give that a little softer edge because that malar fat now would be the slow turn of that form in and around. We hook back up with the shape of the nostril on that side. And then you could see this might be the instance of that lost edge, where here I feel like the cast shadow ends in a way where the light just starts to kind of fall and become less associated with the harder lines of that cast area or shadow. Okay, so let's keep our mapping going over here. So we left off with the malar fat, and that kind of comes into where we discussed the buccal fat. We discussed that as being round, right? So I'm going to time that and soften it. But hopefully you can get a sense of how, if you found any of the prior head constructions to look a little stark or quirky, you can really see that it hopefully starts to kind of become a little bit more softened, a little bit more quote unquote realistic, or have a more of a feeling of naturalism. While we're here, we might want to just light the ball of the mouth. That's not a horrible idea. I'm just thinking about that same idea, the denture sphere, but expressing it in a slightly different way. That all of this, let's just do it lightly, would be separating. The light would roll across that form in a unique way. And then while we're kind of tracing this outside shadow line down, let's also hit the chin, which I'm seeing as an egg. So an egg, we'd be getting a coarse shadow with a nice gradation that takes the viewer's eye from the area of light and without any kind of abrupt change or shift, just walks them into that coarse shadow and then shadow. And then I see that coming over here. Look at how coarse shadow blends with that jowl fat that's dropped. Right? So that's that form that we discussed as a great way to kind of demarcate a more advanced stage. That pulls back up, but a different kind of shadow experience here, the turn around that jaw. That feels more like a cylinder to me, so more abrupt. On this side, I'm getting a little bit of that would mostly just be kind of halftone, but this face is turning away here. And then the last kind of big area that I would see or set up for light and shadow would be just the other side of the socket here. So I'm going to come back in and change every line to an edge. So this would be socket line. I'm going to make that hard because it's a box, or maybe as it starts to pull down, it could be a little softer because this would be representative of the soft tissue or fat around the eye that's kind of dropped. And now let's do the same thing to this eye. I think we have a cast shadow coming across from the brow. And I could see that here because it's kind of jumping up over that little shape of the eyelid or that tarsus plate, and then maybe onto the eye a bit itself. And then I'm going to take that whole of the eye, and just like we did to the other side, give that a nice just kind of paint as a core shadow, and just light that big form, so I don't have to worry about getting in there and doing the smaller details around it. And then that conclude up here. It's a cast shadow from that upper area or upper socket. So I'm designing and trying to come back to that big idea of shape. So once I get to about this point, I mean, there's a few other kind of just relative to the face areas we could hit, like the ear has some nice cast shadow shapes to it. And even if you don't know what's there, it can be a fun way to just begin to investigate light and shadow by looking at these different graphic shapes just for the shape themselves. Maybe what you could do if you're not as familiar with the form is look at the different aspects to the shape, and well, this part of that shape is kind of blurry. I wonder why that would be, or this part of the shape is really sharp. And that's just going back to all the timing that I'm talking about. So that's here. And then we get this ridge from the hook that we talked about. And this looks like a box to me, so that's pretty abrupt. And that swings in. So once I get to this point, the next thing that I would do is I'm thinking about the value composition of my scene or of my piece. So I have a value 1, that's the page. I have a value 10 based on the intensity of the lighting. That's kind of what I staged my core shadow at. So I'm going to fill it in to begin at a value 5. So I would just take from this point and start to paint in an idea of the face or the shadow as a consistent value all the way down. And if I did a good job mapping my edges, it should start to take on a subtle feeling of form or of realism. Right? The goal at this point wouldn't be to come in and start to paint everything out yet. It's just to key. Really, I'm trying to key the large values in relationship to the form of the face in that area of lighting and where it hits it. So we have this. Notice also that I'm going to lose this edge. So it's important to me that we don't walk around with big outlines around our head. So that would be, something that could be deceiving from the study that we just made. Everything has to be a line and have a reason. Well, we don't have this. We see edges. So I like to lose a lot of those edges, right, in terms of painting these pieces out. So when you're making these, don't feel like you have to be restricted to the outline. That would be that idea of the lost edge or the compositional edge. Maybe you blow out that side of the form because it's starting to compete too much with where you want the focal point to be. Usually with portraits, I'll create more detail or more visual interest by finishing one eye. And then from there, the rest of the composition or the rest of the piece can be a little bit more soft. I don't want to stage the attention to be in one area. So here would be the filled shape of the cast shadow area off the nose. Once we have our form there, then we could start to drop in our shadow around the bottom of the neck and face. This is a lighter or a weaker cast shadow, but we could still put one down here. Hugs that jowl fat, and then maybe comes across the neck, then maybe onto the scarf or the shirt. The last thing we want to do here, though, is maybe let's map out these lips. I don't want to leave those just too loose in terms of the denture sphere itself. So I get that form shadow on the top lip, and then this looks like it's cast. So that would be a cast shadow that's coming from the upper lip, and then maybe living on the lower lip. So now all those planes that I put in there come back and aid me. Just give me an idea of how one would be impacting the other. And it curves in and then back out again. This area I think that's a cylinder. So this kind of rolls up a bit. And then by the time we get out here, that looks a little bit more sphere-like. So maybe on this, he's raising that corner of his mouth up. And then all of this here kind of has a cool cast shadow look. So that comes down, up, and then we see here there's a form shadow for the lip. So even the forms, as they get smaller and smaller, you won't be confused because you still know how to read each one. This is a box, this is a cylinder, despite the fact that they're intimidating. And then this lower lip, maybe that makes a cast shadow. And that comes down and then just sits or glances, maybe even comes out and forward onto the top of that chin there. Then all of this comes back and up, and then meets up with that initial shape here, but I'll probably loose that edge a bit, and then we'll just fill it in. And by the time you get done, you're going to start to find that a lot of those lines and points and planes that you worked hard to develop are going to start to get ghosted, or you'll lose. They won't become as prominent, especially if you kept a lighter touch through most of the drawing, and that you'll just be left with good scaffolding to help with your decision making around tone.